Okay, so as I said, yes, so here's this is steps towards building interoperability in research tools using PIDs, which is perhaps somewhat of a mouthful. But if we go to the next slide, I can maybe explain a little bit about the background. So this is really in conjunction with two initiatives which are going on. One I know some of you are already aware of and or involved in the relatively new RDA Working with PIDs and Tools interest group, which had its first meeting at the recent plenary in Gothenburg. And there's a second, again, related initiative, a grant to DataCite and RSpace from EOSC Futures and RDA, which is dealing with this topic of data and metadata interoperability through incorporating PIDs in a research infrastructure. Next slide, please. So today we're going to be reporting, we're about, I guess, a third of the way through this EOSC RDA project. And today, Xiaoli and Vaida are going to be reporting on what the project is about and progress to date and what remains to be done. So there are kind of four things, big picture. One, we're looking at four outputs that we're working towards. One is doing user research and use case definition to try to understand PID workflows and how they fit in with research tools. So that's the first point. Coming out of that, we're trying to do something quite concrete and specific, which is a high-level design for incorporating DataCite DOIs, in particular, IGSNs, into the RSpace digital research platform. And then third, actually going beyond high-level design and actually implementing a proof of concept for IGSN support in RSpace, which enables registering populating metadata and sending it to DataCite and publishing a landing page. And then the fourth output is more generic, doesn't relate to RSpace specifically. It's a more high-level interoperability guideline document for integrating IGSNs into research infrastructures generally. So with that introduction, I'm going to pass over to Xiaoli.
Thanks, Rory, for the introduction. And my part is also going to be quite brief, and I will come from the other projects I'm leading. It's called Implementing Fair Workflows, which have integration component, and this is also kind of how we converged on the topic of PID integrations. So one brief sentence about DataCite. I work at DataCite, and DataCite is a global nonprofit membership organization working with repositories to provide DOIs for a wide range of research outputs and resources. We're talking about beyond just research data. We're still like you can register DataCite DOIs for samples, images, preprints, and all a suite of other types of resources that you interact with throughout the research life cycle. So the project I'm leading is a proof of concept study in the field of consciousness. So on the one hand, we work with a research team at Max Planck Institute of Empirical Aesthetics to have the researcher implement fair sharing practices throughout his entire PhD research. And on the other hand, we also work with a suite of partner organizations to implement PID supporting features and workflows on their platform. This included the DMP tool at the California Digital Library, the Dryad data repository. RDC is working with us to build in PID interoperability between DOIs and RAID, the research activity identifier they developed, and Cronus Hub is a publishing supporting platform that we want to build in PID supported linkage between manuscripts and dataset. With CDAR, we want to give metadata template DOIs so they can be cited and reused on other platforms. and Crossref and Center for Open Science are, project supporters. So yeah, like I said, the concept of the end-to-end workflow is to use PIDs and relational metadata as a hub of activity about particular body of research, bringing disparate pieces of those research activity together by virtue of linking research entity together. So on the right-hand side is a symbolic research lifecycle diagram where different research activities and different types of outputs will emerge and have the as they emerge, there should be an opportunity for them to be properly identified and systematically captured in terms of metadata and associated with all of the important entities that are associated with them, including upstream and downstream outputs, and also the researchers that's involved in creating them and the institutions that support them and the funding opportunities that make this viable. So the logic is quite straightforward. There's 3-layer structure in this approach. So on layer 1, you identify all of the relevant entities with different types of PIDs, DOIs for outputs, ORCID for people, and then all of this metadata is captured on what we call the PID graph, where this PID metadata are interoperable based on a commonly agreed on data structure, exchange structure, and then through that each of these PID providers provide API and accessibility method to query this data and make them useful for other platforms. In terms of DataCite, this will be the DataCite Commons and DataCite open APIs. So this enables the find and connect of research through this interconnectivity of the PID infrastructure. And so since we're talking about interoperability, I thought first and foremost is we don't use this in a very vague way. So we're on track with the conversation. So there are the interoperability between PIDs, which is based on a metadata schema that supports connection metadata, like linkage between different types of PIDs, and also like common information exchange model to aggregate and expose linkage metadata across platforms. This is on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're also talking about research tools, right? The interoperability between these different tools that support seamless cross-platform data management workflow, and then on top of that, facilitate the metadata of these research objects, the metadata creation and enrichment and reuse across these systems. So these are 2 types of interoperabilities, and they can, become mutually supplemental based on the way you integrate them. And I roughly, through our experience discussing this, I roughly put this down in a diagram where we thought it's important to specify there are the metadata have a circulation route, and all of these stakeholders play different roles in the metadata circulation process. So here on the one hand, we have the PID metadata publisher, the metadata contributor, and the metadata consumer. What they are, the publisher are the organization and platforms that are responsible for the resources and directly create metadata and register PIDs for them. The PID contributor are organizational platforms that generate valuable metadata about resources, wish to contribute them to the PID graph, but do not directly register PIDs. And then we have the metadata consumer. These are organizations and platforms that harvest, aggregate, or query metadata, PID metadata, to realize their own functionalities, to build their own applications. And one organization or platform, they can and usually take on multiple roles, but this should be very clear from the beginning when you conceive the idea of integrating PID functionalities and PID workflows, like which role are you taking on with your platform. And on the other hand, obviously, are the continuous integration between the different PID infrastructures and the PID, like the improvement of the PID graph. And this also very much depend on like the completeness and the richness of the metadata that is contributed through all of these other, like stakeholder groups. So there are integrations between there are research tools integrations with the PID systems, and their integrations amongst themselves, right? There are different types of integrations. So what does it mean for the tools and platforms? There's, in general, 3 directions you can go. So you're either directly register, maintain PIDs for research outputs that are produced and hosted on your platform. This means giving PIDs for alternative research outputs and thus make research fair. Or you can ingest PID metadata to provide evaluating functionalities to increase discoverability, to enhance usability, like auto-completion of input fields and suggestion of related outputs. Or there's another way is to contribute metadata to PID registering platforms through system integrations. So say you don't you don't host all of this information, but you can have an integration with a host like a repository and work with them to feed, standardized metadata, and they can feed that to the PID system. So these are like appending new connection metadata that was not available when the PID was registered. This could happen, like a DMP ingest, like new related outputs, this type of integration. So this is a diagram for what the type of integrations we're building in the project. So through that, so this DMP tool, CDAR, and Dryad, and Cronus Hub have different integrations on different capacity that is directly to DataSite, and CDAR and Dryad would have their own integrations for Dryad to ingest structured metadata through CDAR template, and the Cronus Hub have a integration with Dryad to suggest existing research datasets to their manuscript submission workflow as an example. So yeah, so that was a conversation starter and how we put together the working with PIDs and tools interest group. So just another shout out, and if you're not have not joined that group, go to RDA website and do that. And this forum is very open. Yeah, so welcome your comments, your experience, your use cases. At this point, I hand over to Vida.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Xiaoli, for that. I will take over the screen. Can you confirm you're able to see? Yes, I see. Awesome. So I'll just move this down a little bit out of the way. All right. So hi, everyone. I'm Vida, and I am part of Research Space. So we build a modern digital research platform, and what we focus on is institutional research data management. So we do have an electronic lab notebook and a sample management system, but these are really tightly integrated. I do mostly product and user experience work. So taking us right from the start of user research and understanding requirements, talking to users, to design, and then to having actual features that are useful for researchers, while the developers do all the magic work of making the feature happen. So just to give you some context, our space inventory is what I'm going to be talking about in terms of the tool that we're using as a concrete example of a tool that might want to be part of the interoperability workflow. And so you have a sample management system and you want to add identifiers to samples. So just as an introduction, Rory gave a good overview of the 4 different outputs, but just to remind you, the goal is really to go through the process of incorporating PIDs in a research platform and documenting our experience and identifying the kind of friction points and suggesting possible approaches. So it's very, very exploratory, and in order to have something concrete to talk about, we decided to take IGSNS, so DataCite IGSNS, and see how they can be implemented in RSpace inventory. Keep in mind when I mention RSpace or I say inventory, I'm just meaning RSpace inventory. It's the same thing for this context. So we're trying to exemplify a concrete workflow. Let's say FieldMark, which is an offline data collection tool. Let's say you're working in the fields, you're collecting samples using FieldMark and recording some basic metadata. Then you're wanting to pass that to RSpace inventory, where you're going to do some experimental work that you're going to record. You're going to populate the metadata, and then you're going to mint the identifier there as well and push some data to DataCite. And then you might want to push that sample data to Dataverse for archiving. So here are the kind of 3 specific tools, and we're going to try to explore how they could work within this context. Fair warning, the slides are information rich. I kind of got ahead of myself, and I will be going pretty quickly, but luckily the session is recorded, so I'll try to give an overview and context for the slides, and you'll be able to kind of review them in more depth depending on which parts you're most interested in. So I'll be going through the user research, some use cases, talking about some conceptual schemas. Then I'll talk about the high-level design and the proof of concept that we're developing, and a bit of some takeaway thoughts and the future work that's upcoming. So as a first step, we need to understand what even is the current context. And for me, like I have a background in computer science, but it seems like it's very different from lab science, where you deal with samples. So I need to learn about the domain, right? So we've been having extended conversations specifically with 2 research bodies, UIT, the Arctic University of Norway, the Geoscience Department, and their authors-led research that do agricultural research. And we specifically chose 2 different types of work so that we'd be able to understand the research workflows within these institutions, their technical infrastructure, how it differs, how their domain work differs, and to see how this can be generalized into a shared workflow. And also obviously understanding their desired IGSN functionality. The goal is to end up with some write-ups that express their needs clearly. So the first issue we encountered is that it's quite difficult for both us and other bodies, say, to understand and to have a conversation together when it's very hard to even wrap our hands around the technical and the conceptual approaches that would be ideal, because there's no real shared knowledge base for essential resources. And that leads to misunderstandings on how workflows might work. So just to give an example, we would have calls and I would actually wonder, okay, so is RSpace going to provide a public landing page? Maybe DataCite is going to provide a public landing page. And then the institution tell us, oh, well, we already have some repositories for hosting samples. Maybe we should provide the landing page. And there's confusion about who plays which role. And it's hard for all parties to basically idealize a workflow and start conceptualizing it when there's not a shared language, and there might be mismatched expectations. That also means a high barrier to entry to even starting considering PIDs. So that's why we're thinking it would be really useful to have some, not an extensive, but just a singular place that would have all the basic resources and would link to places to learn more, both about conceptual and technical aspects of IGSNs, such as conference workshop outputs, which are actually really useful for understanding what people think. Then it makes sense for us to continue to have extended discussions across different parties of interest, but these have to be in some way documented, and the outputs, whether they're use cases, mockups, or prototypes, it'd be good to share that. The RDA working with PIDs and tools interest group might be a good place for this as well, to have some conversations. So that's the kind of first thing we were thinking about. The very first link the very first video here, I think is really useful because it gives different perspectives on IGSNs, from users to how an ELN might approach it, or I think it's Fieldmark actually that's given as an example, and how an institution might approach it is really good. I'd recommend having a look. So, okay, let's say we've talked to people, we tried to clear things up as much as we can. We have some write-ups. Now it's time to make these write-ups into specific use cases. You know, when something, I want to something, so I can something. So things like, you know, when I'm back from the field, I want to send all the samples to RSpace so I can populate the rest of the record. Okay, so the good aspect of the whole write-up between different institutions and the conversations we had is that we can generalize into a basic interoperable workflow. Like if we boil it down, I think Shelley covered it as well, is that you start with a sample with the research cycle. So you have a sample in inventory. You either have already started with inventory, or maybe you import it from the previous stage, say Fieldmark. You register an IGSN, and that's where you interact with DataCite API. You complete the metadata fields, and then you publish. And so you create a public landing page, you push the metadata, which is the IGSN, and the landing page to DataCite. And DataCite at this point handles discoverability and indexing and the PID graph. And if you want to push the data and the metadata to the next stage, say to a Dataverse archive repository, you can do that. And as you can see in green are all the steps that are related to some kind of interoperability. So that seems pretty solid as a place to start. And it seems like the existing literature and work on IGSNs is consistent with this understanding. So if we look at this paper, that's really, really good, the IGSN 2040 technical model, you have this graph, and our understanding maps onto this quite nicely. So you take RSpace, we're called an IGSN agent. The researcher can register an IGSN, and that goes into DataCite, and the DataCite actually handles the registration, and then the researcher can publish metadata, and then we, aside from this flow, can then interact with Fieldmark and the repository. So it seems to be pretty consistent, where we're kind of validated in our approach. But when we're actually going into the details, the full use cases document is really long, and there's a lot to consider. So I don't want to go through all of it, because we wouldn't be able to really talk about anything really interesting. So I'd like to pick out a few specific use cases and our thoughts on them so far. So one use case is even before you start using RSpace, really. Let's say you're planning to implement IGSNs in your institution. The things we've heard is researchers want a clear guide on how to fill in the IGSN metadata so it's consistent, especially within their domain, so things are searchable. You want to be connected to a group of other domain experts to be able to understand how to best approach workflows, and how, again, to record specific interactions, such as relationships between items. You want to be able to define sample templates. And my first thought was that obviously I got a bit overwhelmed with the amount of stuff, and I thought, okay, some of these, obviously all of these are related to RSpace in some way, because users will be doing and thinking about these within RSpace, but they can't really be addressed with RSpace features. So what is our role here? And that's when we started looking at the responsibility aspect, where a clear guide on how to fill in metadata, it makes sense that the domain community actually develops that, and RSpace is able to then implement that. If you're talking about workflows, then the IGSN community, the broader IGSN community, and the domain community can communicate. If it's about sample templates, well, the technical work is by us, but the standards for interoperability which should really be defined by the IGSN community. So again, this traces back to what Shelley was talking about roles and specific roles within this ecosystem. This is another representation of what she was showing earlier, and we map onto it just like this. So you have a user or a community, and they use an ELN or a like. They mint the IGSNs, and that connects to DataCite, which then takes care of all the like complicated backend and links. And on our side, we're able to provide the IGSN backend. We provide landing pages, and then in this case, DataCite also plays this role, but the ability to have a search portal for a domain and be able to index items can be taken by the role of domain aggregator or information aggregator. So what I like here is that if you take the example of users want to have a search portal and landing pages that are really suited for their domain, say they work with a lot of map data, they want to see a lot of maps and the locations being represented as maps rather than just a text field with latitude and longitude, then what that really falls onto is that the domain aggregator for that community interacts with DataCite and finds all of the landing pages that are relevant to that domain and the landing pages are then hosted, let's say, by RSpace, and they're able to pull that and then display it in a specific way. And by separating the concerns in this way, RSpace can focus on providing the metadata, but the job of aggregation and search becomes the responsibility of the information aggregator, which then each domain can communicate with. So that kind of simplifies things a little bit. Same is for aspects such as domain vocabulary. So say you have a community and they want to understand how to best phrase things and best implement the IGSN schema. And so they'll interact with DataCite and within their own community to implement this, and RSpace will simply support the field types and will not have to worry about getting involved in the conversation on the specifics, because we don't have the domain expertise ourselves for all these different research domains. So it seems like there's a real need to clarify responsibilities of each party so that we can have targeted work and not exponential work where everyone has a different idea and is building all the features. And conceptual schemas are really useful in progressing understanding and how this can best be done. So we can meet in the middle. And this is just a reminder for me, speak a bit more slowly. There's going to be a few of those. So use case 2 is populating metadata. So what we've done just now is that we looked at some use cases and we said, okay, these are addressed because once we figure out the conceptual schema a bit better, some use cases do not fall under something that RSpace can do. Okay, now let's consider what are use cases that RSpace is responsible for. When I'm filling in information about a sample in the inventory system, which is obviously a core use case, here's a long list of aspects of this that are all pretty core requirements. You want to fill in IGSN specific metadata as well as domain specific metadata that requires different field types. You might want to relate the sample to other items or add related identifiers. You might want to have like a private view so that your inventory system has all the details, but then a landing page maybe obscures some more sensitive data. So my real summary for this slide is really just that there's a lot going on and there's a lot that is scope for work. So there's clearly a need to kind of figure out where to start with all this. And the other aspect is metadata across systems, because we talked about internally, let's say you're doing an action in RSpace, but what about the interoperability, right? So let's say you're pushing data from FieldMark to RSpace. You've been in the field, you've collected some data, and now you're pushing the data to RSpace to work in the ELN, say. A core requirement is that you want the structure of the metadata that you recorded in FieldMark. Maybe you had, a specific template for your sample. you want that to be perfectly replicated in RSpace, so there's no data loss and you can continue your work just without thinking about it. And that actually requires quite a few things. There needs to be a templating system in both FieldMark and RSpace that is able to integrate and that is consistent, so there's no metadata loss. And there needs to be an ability to generate sample templates on the fly based on FieldMark samples that are received. And so it's quite an involved API integration. Now let's take the other direction. You have RSpace and you're sending samples to Dataverse because you're archiving the sample data from the experiment and you've already minted an IGSN in RSpace, let's say. When you're doing that and you're pushing a sample to Dataverse, you do not want it to mint a new identifier for the sample. Because let's say Dataverse sees, oh, okay, this is a sample, and automatically it says, well, I should mint an IGSN then, so you have a permanent record for the sample, but there's already one that exists. So there has to be a way to then identify for Dataverse that there is an IGSN property through the metadata and have the features to treat it accordingly. That does involve, again, an API integration that has to be present at any stage in the process. If not, we're dealing with, let's say, an interoperable format like CSV that is prone to human error and so on. Like having APIs handle this seems like a no-brainer, but does involve then actual development work. And yeah, you might even want Dataverse to send back the export link of that sample back to RSpace and add that as a resource for that sample to push it to DataCite. So it becomes many arrows in many directions, right? And perhaps it's common sense, but interdependence between tools seems like it requires an actual integration between their features, which then influences what can be done at each stage. So I won't go into detail about other things we were discovering and working through our use cases, but there's obviously variations between and within institutions that add layers of complexity. Say an institution that has several labs that are at different levels of open science maturity, where some have a full workflow already in place and they just want to integrate PIDs, versus another lab that has just started to push things to Dataverse. Say you're going to have to provide an interoperability solution that fits both at the same time without having exponential development works. And also to remind you from the very start, this is only really considering the IGSN workflow and within RSpace inventory. So, and IGSNs are just one kind of PID, and so we're basing all of our assumptions here on how IGSNs are known to function with physical samples, and this might be completely different if you're dealing with other PIDs. So there's a lot going on and there's a lot of complexity. So this is the second part where I end up just sitting and scratching my head and wondering, well, what do we do here? And the takeaway message so far with the use cases is they're definitely very useful. Like and they allow us to at least phrase and make concrete what might be the different requirements and communicate and agree on them. But there's a risk of jumping into problem solving and over designing right away to try to satisfy all these use cases conceptually. But this runs the risk of missing the actual practical real life considerations and things that would only emerge as you start building. So technical limitations, people realizing, oh, so that's what you meant by it's going to do this and not that. And I think it's important to not let perfect be the enemy of decent but not perfect reproducibility. It seems like it's gonna have to be a very iterative process, because also user adoption on this kind of thing only works gradually. If a lab has never really done any kind of reproducibility work, when you ask them to right away, as soon as they create a sample, to fill in a huge variety of metadata fields in a specific format, then it's likely they're just not necessarily going to do that, rather than you know, like, or if you start with just a few fields that are very generic, but allow people to just throw in everything, then at least the data is there and it's, you know, it's possible to save it and then to push it forward and then maybe rework it in a secondary part of the sample metadata processing, maybe data curation, and then iterate on that. So it seems we need to start small, get some feedback, and then build on top of that. So just, I don't want to take too long on these few slides, but we're working on the kind of high level design to try to boil down basically from something general, some discussions, to something more and more concrete. So the use case document has then been transformed into select use cases, a few select use cases for a basic IGSN workflow, meaning what is the minimal set of use cases to be able to have some kind of IGSN functionality and interoperability. So the idea is basically what features we know we definitely need and that won't change that we can start working with. Obviously, this is all the understanding and the design is all based on our tools, so we can't really give a one-size-fits-all solution. This is more an example of how to go through this process of discovery and an example approach and see what we learned from it. So I'm not going to reveal this yet because we need to make sure that, you know, you're eager to read the interim report. The proof of concepts is what comes next. So we have some use cases that we've written up, and we have to figure out an implementation to kind of have a concrete proof of concept. So what features are linked to the use cases? That makes sense. And the idea is to have a really working implementation of the basic workflow using the DataSci API and also using existing RSpace features to integrate it in a way that we would any other feature. And the idea is that as we work on that, we can get some feedback from users testing the prototype, and that will inform the high-level design and prioritizing development. So this is a mock-up as a stage. So I remember that I added a slide at the beginning of this just showing inventory by itself. So here on the right-hand side, to place it into context, you have an identifiers section that will appear on each sample, subsample, container. You're able to select an identifier type. You can add an identifier if you already minted it, or you can register a new identifier, and you're able to consistently do that on any inventory record. So the actual work we've been doing is then to focus really on minting a new identifier and populating the mandatory metadata, so that we focus on the end-to-end, you know, creating sample, minting a new identifier, filling in mandatory metadata, pushing that to DataSite, and publishing a landing page. So that's the flow we're focusing on. And this is a mock-up by one of our developers that's been actually implemented into inventory. So and the API work to actually make it do something in the back end. So we've selected the different fields and have populated them with realistic values from things we already know, such as the creator name is just, you can be pulled from the RSpace profile. The title can be pulled from the sample name. The publisher can be the institution name. The publication year is the year you minted the identifier. So just to make sure that the process is as quick and easy as possible to start off with. And so we're currently working on clarifying the specs and developing an actually working prototype. The developers are busy connecting the API with this UI, and I'm busy on writing up some development tickets. And other further work that is going to take place is a discussion between the different parties, because now that we've conceptualized some amount of work, we need to understand and agree how we're going to conceptualize the larger aspect of how is RSpace going to then link to Fieldmark and Dataverse. And the output of that is mostly a flow diagram of relationships between these different items and understanding where we had misunderstandings or where there's variations possible. And the final output, as Rory had mentioned at the beginning, is the interoperability guidelines. A good summary is, what do you need to consider when implementing support for PIDs within your research infrastructure? So it's not a holy grail solution of, you're going to be able to create a sample and everything is going to be smooth. It's more, what can we do to make things smoother? How can we even start advice on how to navigate all this based on our experience with this specific example? And to finish off, on my side of the talk, we'd love to get some feedback. Either email me, or you can join the RDA Working with PIDs and Tools Interest group. It would be really, really useful to get feedback on the prototype once that is ready, or have some conversations about use cases, because on my side, I can only infer based on what I know, but having someone who actually has a concrete specific needs explaining that to me is really useful to better approach development. So I think I ran over quite a bit, but hopefully that is okay. And I think I will hand it over back to Rory.
Okay, thank you, Xiaoli, and thank you, Vida. That was really interesting. So we have 15 minutes left, and I noticed we have a really great range of people with different backgrounds and perspectives who are attending the webinar. So please, I don't think there's been any questions posted in the chat or on the Google Doc. So please feel free to either post a question in the chat or unmute and ask the question, and let's have a discussion as well, because there's clearly people here who know much more about many aspects of all this than Xiaoli or Vida and I do. So yes, let's start a discussion.
And
Yeah,
should
I
we
will
stop the
also
recording?
stop the recording.
Stop the recording,
so
yes,
we
yep.
can
Yep.
discuss freely.
Thank you.